Hey everyone, it's another video about UV retopology using geometry nodes. In the first video, we learned how to do this basic sleeve, which was simple because it's just a rectangle. And in the second video, we learned how to make this setup where we can edit our UV map with mesh tools by converting it into mesh. And also we can project things onto it so that we get retopology in real time. This video will be the practical application, where we use these tools to finish retopologizing this outfit. I've already done the skirt because it's also very simple, but this shirt is going to get complicated because, as we can see, it has a variety of different shapes that aren't rectangular, and that's always a problem when doing retopology. And this workflow is not a silver bullet that is going to solve those problems for us. What this workflow does is remove a lot of the messing around that comes from doing retopology in world space, like if you're shrink wrapping and snapping things to a surface. The fundamental problems of retopology are still questions like, what should my loop flow be? How do I deal with non-rectangular shapes? What compromises do I make? What is this topology going to be optimized for? These tools don't solve that, but in my opinion, they make it a lot easier to work with and to try different things because you can get immediate visual feedback and you can morph between different stuff. So I'm going to be showing how I approach that in this tutorial. Before we get to the hard stuff, let's start with the easier skirt. This was very straightforward because this came with rectangular UVs and it's all rectangles. So all this is my UV mesh here. Started out as a rectangle that I then subdivided. For this section down here, it's not quite evenly spaced because if we look at this skirt, you can see that the back saw of the pleats is not as long as the front. But it's still very simple. The process was just take a face, snap its corners to the whole thing, like this, and then add a bunch of horizontal cuts so we can see it more easily, and then start using snapping to add these loops at the appropriate place. If this is on top of this, with a displacement so it sticks off the surface, it's very easy to line up any given loop. So you just go down this, and that's it. Once all that is done, then we take this output in world space. I'm going to copy it, and without the displace on, do a visual geometry to mesh. And then there's a little bit of manual cleanup because these edges aren't merged. So select the relevant edges, do a by distance merge, and then check for any that these ones were a bit off. It's a couple points back here. And then it's just a matter of maybe marking some edges as seams or with crease. We can use a face angles selection to get all of this stuff. And then it's just adding the modifiers, and it looks like this. And especially with subsurf on, it's very nice and clean. But once we've done the shirt, we'll need to do the same process of merging those islands, but that's not a big deal to do. Now, a quick side note before we dive into that. I'm using topology that came from Marvelous Designer, but I know some people following this just have whatever topology and whatever UVs from something they've modeled. So I want to remind you all of the quad remesher tool. So these UV methods I've been showing assume that your mesh has fairly even spacing. That's why the whole thing where we pin the edges and then hit everything inside with a smooth brush works. So here's a copy I've made where I've deleted a bunch of loops so things aren't even. And we want to get this to be even before we start applying these other methods. So what I've done first is on all these seam lines, I've split the edges and I've made a shape key that spreads them out. This is just so we can see what is happening. You don't actually need to literally spread it out like this. And now I will copy it and hit it with a visual geometry to mesh to apply that shape key because quad remesh will ignore it. Then we can go to quad. We've got 429 faces, so I'll do a quad remesh with 450 and hit OK. And that's not great, so let's try again with some more faces. Not that many. And sometimes you want to try a few times or use a different seed. And after a while, you should have something like this. And note that this is a bit rough on the edges. If we match it back up with this again, you can see that you're going to need to go in by hand and snap some of these edges to clean this up. But it does have good spacing now. And if we flip over to UV editing and do an unwrap, it's basically got the right sort of shapes, and now it's easy to go on with the rest of the process. Or, depending on how this turned out, you may not even need to. You may just want to come in with the space tool a bit on loop tools in world space and, even your loops out a bit. And depending on what you're doing, that may be good enough. Maybe you can call it a day there and skip all of the rest of this. But if it's not, then let's get on to the next step. Okay, let's clean up these islands. I did a couple of these in the last video, but I didn't keep it all synced up. So I'm going to redo these 3 on a time lapse real quick, because this one is our main subject. So we'll do all of this in a shape key as well, just so that we keep the original if we need it. Like before, I'm going to stick to fairly simple tools: active element snapping, proportional editing and sculpting, and the loop tools add-on. At this point, I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm going to make a backup copy and go ahead and do a merge by distance to remove the various doubles, which does mean I have to respace a few of these loops. All right, so that's all been pretty easy so far. Now we can do the very obvious thing here. Since this is a rectangle, we'll just go through that too. And now it's time to actually start thinking about, what do we need this mesh to be? We can see we've got that showing up over here. It's time to split this so we can watch both. And on this mesh, I've got a displace here. And that's just to set this off the surface a bit so we can see it more easily. So one of the first things we have to think about is, how many points do we need where the sleeve meets the shirt? And whatever number we want that to be, we need to make sure it's the same on both. So at the moment I've got 4, which I think is a fine amount. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There was more before. Maybe I should go up a little bit, but I think 4 will do. And, well, why does 4 do? Why this many loop cuts in each direction? It's squares, that's nice, but how do I know that I need this many and not more? Even on something as simple as this, before I know what I need, I have to start asking myself questions like, what is this for? For example, do I want this to be even squares? Do I need another loop at the edge here because I'm going to add some trim, or like make it look like the shirt's rolled up again, or, bevel this or whatever? Am I going to be like sculpting any wrinkles into this, or like manually making stylized wrinkles? And I could do that in 2D space here and then like displace them. There's lots of ways this could go, even on something this simple. So in the case of this project, I do know what I'm going to be doing already. First of all, I want an undetailed but very clean version of the mesh that will be used as a cloth sim base. I'll run the cloth sim on this mesh and then bind the eventual detailed version to that with surface deform, well, a GeoNodes version. Cloth sim works best with fairly evenly spaced vertices and a quad mesh. The original mesh from Marvelous Designer is actually a reasonable cloth sim mesh because the vertex density is consistent, even though some of the loop flow is weird. But I also want clean loops. And I want those because there's 2 more things I'm doing with this. I'll be copying this to make the detailed version of the mesh, and that will eventually have a subdivision surface on it. And subsurf also works best with fairly evenly spaced quads. It can handle triangles, but they can do some weird things, as we'll see later. And the other thing I'm going to be doing is projecting detail decals onto this using its UV map, We'll cover that in a later video, but basically I'm going to attach a detail mesh through UV projection, and that also does best with evenly spaced quads. But there's still more. I'm also probably going to be using this undetailed version of the mesh for normal transfer, and normals also want evenly spaced quads. So it really is evenly spaced quads all the way down here, except for the detail mesh I'll make from this. Now, what I don't care about too much is the poly count. I don't necessarily need to go that high poly because I'm going to have subsurf anyway, but this isn't a game model. This is an offline rendering model that won't leave Blender. Maybe I'll make a game version in the future, but it would be retopologized and baked down. So if I have a situation where just using more vertices solves my problems, then I'll just do that. So now that I know what I want out of this, I can answer the question of how many vertices do I need here where this joins? And the answer is definitely more than 4, but probably less than 8. And once I subsurf this, we're going to get an extra 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. So I'll have enough. So it's easy to know what we want on this little sleeve thing, but this is a much more complicated shape and it's not evenly spaced. And it's not going to break down into an easy rectangle. But since we know that this connection point needs to be 4 vertices, we have a pretty good idea of what we're going to start with here. And on a more complex garment, this might not be so obvious, but here this is pretty straightforward. And thanks to this setup, we can just watch what we're doing in real time. So let's keep going and make this as rectangly as we can and see when we start running into issues. And at this point, our color here is starting to block things. So we could add a mask modifier and hide that, but I'm just going to turn off my displays and look at the backside. So here's where we're actually starting to get to issues of like, how do we reconcile this? We're going to end up with a triangle somewhere, aren't we? We have some choices about where. And at this point, I'm kind of just doodling. I didn't really plan this out in advance. So I'm just doing what seems easy, but is still mostly rectangular. And while even in this out, I'm more looking at what it looks like in world space rather than UV space, because that's what's going to matter more. Notice that when smoothing, it doesn't update until you leave sculpt mode. So at a certain point, the question here is going to be, when is this the right topology? When is this good topology? Is this ever going to be good topology? Do I have any idea what I'm doing here? And again, this is kind of a question that highly depends on what you're doing this for. Also, remember that once we apply this, we will do some more spacing in world space. So don't worry about like this sort of thing. That doesn't really matter. So when can I stop and move on to the next thing? When is this good enough for my purposes? I've got this weld modifier, which is going to merge those points together before this displace. So when is this done? When is this good? Well, that really depends on what you're doing. And this is, the whole other side of retopology. Having tools that put things on surfaces don't answer this question for you. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is good enough because I'm going to apply this and then hit this with space tool again in world space, and that will serve my purposes. The only thing I'm not really sure about is if I want to add a loop here. Like, we could do that. And that keeps this a little cleaner, but now I've introduced a triangle, and let's see what happens when we subsurf this. I'm not crazy about that. Yeah, I don't think I really like what that's doing. And again, the point here is that having this set up lets us just try these things and look at it and get immediate visual feedback. But yeah, I think with those creases, I would rather have this face be stretched than introduce another point here. Although, again, depending on what you're doing, that may not be the right choice for you. So as you can see, you can kind of doodle around quite a bit here before you really decide what you want. And again, that is the point, to be able to let you do this and have it not be a huge amount of clicking around and snapping, because if you're doing this in world space, there are some tools that can adjust the spacing quickly, like the space command here, but it will desync your mesh, so you need a shrink wrap, and that introduces problems, and all of this is just making it that much simpler to do this, what is really an artistic and a creative process. So this isn't perfect, but I'm not going to make you watch me move points around. I'll probably show in the next video what this actually ends up as. This point is really off. That's got to be something to do with the UV map. Maybe I should get into the UV map and edit things around a bit, which kind of brings us to what the next topic will be, which is that we can edit the UV map to change things as well as editing this mesh. Let's put it back on this first, though. Okay, so what exactly do we do with a shape like this? It's almost rectangular in some areas. We can straighten out some of this stuff and do our usual tricks. Oh, and I started a new shape key, so I'm putting the change to this on a separate key. Okay, so this is getting simpler enough that we could start thinking about adding a grid to it. We can see that that's working just fine on the back already. Now, how do we want to handle this point? I could bring this down here and say, put it here and knife stuff in and then start snapping this stuff over, and that'll be annoying and take a bit. So I don't really want to do that. I actually did that off camera and then decided this is way too annoying to show. So I want to make this island even simpler. Put our 3D cursor in the middle of the top and line up our very end point to that. So we've really gridified this shape now. Well, we've made it a rectangle as much as we're going to. And we've done this at great cost to the spacing of these verts here. But let's see what happens now. I would like to figure out a GeoNode setup to automatically force spacing. And actually there is one, which is lofting, but that'll have to be a subject for a later video. All right, so we've got that. That's working quite nicely. And for the very last one, we'll just scale it to a point. Okay, it looks like I could use a few more loops in some of these. So let's hide these last points and hit everything with the space tool on parallel. That's given us even spacing. I'm not sure I want that, because how that flows. See which loop this is here. I probably just need to redo this loop cut with a few less loops. So that would just be a matter of dissolving this and redoing it. So think for a minute about how hard and how time consuming it would be to do that and adjust your loop count if you were snapping this to the surface with shrink wrap. So this is showing what is really powerful about this method. Instead of having to adjust the topology to fit the mesh, we adjusted the mesh to fit the topology, which means we can keep the topology relatively simple. So say I did want to have all of this stuff completely evenly spaced, but still change this loop to say come across to here. Let's morph this UV island some more. I can grab this whole edge and scale it with proportional editing, and I can see that's adjusting stuff, but it's getting down to the tip too. So we probably only want to do that maybe that far. And that's kind of redistributing these loops. So we could play around with that more, but an easier way to do it for many people might be to use sculpt mode. So here's the grab brush. I'm going to allow mesh boundary, but lock X and Y, only change Z. And now we can sculpt our UV map to get the desired changes we want. And we might want to change the fall off on this too, because it's smooth. Or we can just hit this with the smooth brush and respace some things out. It's a bit unintuitive because what you do here basically gives you the inverse here. but it's still relatively easy to make changes. And this way it can be done a bit more artistically, I suppose. And maybe we could also use the grab brush and lock Z, but not X, and nudge some stuff around. For this one, we probably do want the mesh boundary locked, though. So that's going to distribute things here. So with this sort of thing, of course, we can come back in with space tools and let's smooth some things out. But it makes it pretty easy to get to whatever result you want because you can just watch it happening in real time. So whether you prefer edit mode or sculpting or modifiers, you could use a lattice for this, unless you get to whatever you want. Now, for the last thing I might do for this is get back some of my vertex spacing by merging some of these points. So I'm not sure this is how I want it to work. I might leave it as just quads for now for my own purposes, but if we merge some of these, then that's going to reduce the vert count, of course. So we can do something like that, and maybe a couple more of these further up. And that will keep a more evenly spaced vertex density. I'll do one more of these. So this is where you kind of have to make some sort of sacrifice if you don't want to have too much stuff too close together. So I think you get the idea at this point. The power of this tool is that you can work on the topology itself, or you can edit the UV island, and you can do both in real time while watching what it does. And obviously, how exactly you use this workflow, or if this seems intuitive to you, is going to be a matter of personal preference for people. But this is how I like working on it. Once we're happy with this, which this isn't perfect, but I'm not going to spend more time on camera, the last step is to do a visual geometry to mesh with all these extra stuff disabled, and then come in with our loop tools and space tools and do whatever final pass in world space. And that will get you to your finished mesh. Oh, and one other important thing that I forgot to show, but I'm not going to go back, is you do, of course, need to make sure that the number of points here on the collar and the shirt line up, same as we did on the sleeve. But that's going to take some time to do, because we'll need to come here and count up the number of points up here and down the back, which is 16, and then make sure we have that many points here, which we actually do, but the spacing isn't quite right. So we'll adjust the spacing more so that these line up on this side, and then after we apply everything, we would merge these together. And then, of course, you've already got a UV map. We can take this and a data transfer, and we can grab this exact same mesh here and make that the UV map using, well, I won't go through the whole thing as we showed it in previous videos, but set this position to the UV map and transfer it over here, and your UV map is already done. All right, well, I think you get the idea at this point. Of course, there's lots of different loop flows we could do. I'm not claiming this is the optimal way to handle this area, and there's lots of different ways we could have approached the island shape or whatever. And these UVs aren't necessarily ideal for baking textures or something, but it gives you a basis. But for now, I'm going to go and finish up this stage of this outfit, and then I'll be back with more videos as I get to the next stage and start detailing these meshes. And for that, I'll be using some more similar geometry node tools where I work flat and then use UVs and other methods to project details onto the mesh. So like and subscribe if you want to see those. Thanks, and I'll see you next video.